article here. It's called The Deadly Quartet. And we go back now over 30 years, but they said, look, if you had a big belly, if you had high blood pressure, if you had high blood sugar and high cholesterol, you were going to die early. And I looked at that and I thought, okay, those really aren't the causes of death. Those are the effects of bad choices. And so I define my deadly quartet as stress, toxins, malnutrition, and physical inactivity. When we look at how prevalent it is, I literally did a PubMed search just as we were doing the final details. And if you type in pubmed.gov, that takes you to the National Library of Medicine, National Institutes of Health database. And by the way, I'll show a lot of references here where it talks about any topic in health that you want to look at, but literally there are over 1 million medical citations on stress. It may be the most researched topic of all time. And the conclusion they've come to now, and this was before a pandemic, was that literally nearly everyone on planet Earth has chronic stress to the point where their stress hormones are not really doing what they're supposed to do. There's actually a benefit to stress hormones, but there's also a downside. And if stress goes on for far too long, it starts destroying our body, our brain, and our immune system and everything along the way. So we're really not supposed to use the term that's on this slide. But literally there have been a bunch of groups, this one from the Arkansas Medical Society, that are talking about managing stress when things around us change and when we don't really seem in control of our life and our future. And it's well known among the best researchers on the planet that not having a sense of control is the most distressing thing out there. So this is Robert Sapolsky. I've met him in person, world expert in stress physiology from Stanford, probably wrote the best book to date on stress, entitled Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And within that book, he talked about how, a zebra and a lion will literally be sitting next to each other at the water hole drinking. And the lion says, you know what, I'm hungry. And he'll go off on chase on the zebra. Well, the zebra has plenty of defenses where it's not a sure thing that the lion's going to get him. But after this chase is over, as Sapolsky would say, you know what, the zebra knows either the chase is over or I'm over. And one way or the other, it's going to have an ending to it. And it doesn't worry about it. And then it just goes on and relaxes again. But he goes on to say that it's not really the stressors themselves, but our chronic mental processing of the stress, the distress, and what we make of it in our mind that's actually the biggest thing. But it's not just our mind, it's our entire body. So I like this graph. This was a graph of blood flow in different body systems under conditions of rest and conditions of heavy exercise. So a lot of people have heard of the fight or flight response. And literally, when your body feels a stressor, where it feels that your wellness is threatened, it literally takes blood from the critical organs and it puts it into muscle so that we can either fight or flee. The problem is when we're stressed, we're usually not fighting or fleeing. We're just sitting there and marinating in our stress hormones. What I find fascinating is that the liver gets most blood flow at rest, the kidney gets the second most blood flow at rest, and the brain third. So we talked about detoxification last week, and we said, you know what? It literally is our body's highest priority. So if detoxification is what our body thinks is important, maybe we should pay more attention to it. So I definitely recommend living in a clean environment, putting clean things in our body, and periodically cleaning them out in a healthy and structured way. So when we look at head to toe, we can start with the brain. And the first thing they talk about is mood issues. We'll show you later how the blood flow is altered. But when you're under distress, the higher centers of the brain, the real conscious thought, the high level areas, they don't have the blood flow anymore. So your decision making is absolutely altered. Then we go next to the joy centers and the happy centers. And you know what? Those don't get the blood flow either. What gets blood flow is literally our reflex responses. So you want to train yourself literally in life to go with the flow, to easily handle the changes. And then your reflex is actually a nice response rather than something that beats up your body or the world. When we start looking at the cardiovascular system, how does the muscle get all the blood? Well, it's because the blood pressure is increased. the heart rate is increased and blood shuts off from the internal organs and goes out to the muscle. When you look at the immune system, chronic distress is one of the worst things for the immune system. We'll show you the data on that, but we have known for over 50 years that the immune system shuts down in times of stress. Now, you probably can think in your own life when you've gone through really stressful times, you know, it's right after that that usually something goes awry with your wellness. And so obviously one of the strategies can be avoid those times that are going to be really stressful, or you build your body and your immune system in such a way that you can take a big hit in terms of function and yet still be very, very healthy. When we look at the digestive system, a lot of blood goes there. A lot of the immune system is in the digestive system. And there's a lot of people that have inflammatory bowel disease or irritable bowel disease related to distress. Now, for some people that can be constipation, for some people that can be diarrhea, for some people it can, you know, go to both ends of the spectrum, and just things that aren't fun for them. When we start looking at the reproductive system, I'll show you a quote that says we're either making stress hormones or sex hormones, not both. So when we're under distress, we are not thinking about procreating. We're just not. And understand that even though that's a mental urge, it is ultimately biology, and it's to propagate the species. And so under high stress circumstances, you've got to keep your own self alive to procreate later. Then we start looking at aches and pains and loss of bone density. As the body becomes distressed and there's less blood flow, we have a decreased ability to control the inflammatory process. And the joints are one of the places that most people feel it. And then ultimately, stress increases acid in the body, and the bones demineralize. They release their calcium to buffer the acid created by the stress. So osteoporosis can be an outcome of that. So here's Robert Sapolsky again. And this is a book that I read cover to cover. And I will tell you, it's one heck of a read. You probably need to pull out your dictionary for every third or fourth word, because it's very, very technical. But here was the title of the book: Stress, the Aging Brain and Mechanism of Neuron Cell Death. And let me just give you it straight up. Here's what it says: stress ages your brain and kills the brain tissue. It's just that simple. So can stress set up Parkinson's and Alzheimer's? Sure. Can they cause stroke? Yeah. Can they be related to other issues like depression, anxiety? Absolutely. Those are all outcomes of distress. So Daniel Amen, I love his TED Talk. You know, it was entitled What I Learned After 83,000 Brain Scans. And what he learned is that you can change people's brain. You can change how they're wired. You can change their brain from firing a stress response, an anger response, an anxiety response, to a response that's happy and calm and peaceful, but it does take a fair amount of effort. And he asked the question, what if mental health and brain health are really one and the same? And certainly they are very, very, very closely related. So here we have this big, beautiful brain that uses actually 20% of body oxygen at rest. That's really quite a bit. And then look what happens under stress. All of these portions that are related to joy and peace and higher level function shut off. Just by way of brain scans from Daniel Amen, if someone's in a grateful state, that is very healthy and nourishing to the brain as opposed to being in a hateful state. And there's other issues that, you know, over time, including obesity, which, by the way, stress creates obesity by multiple mechanisms. Those all create an unhealthy brain. About a month ago, we did a session on post-traumatic stress disorder. Keep in mind that stress does create a brain trauma. It is an injury to the brain. And so we don't want to take that lightly. People that suffer from post-traumatic stress, you know, we want to be as loving to them as we possibly can and help them nourish their body, mind, and spirit. So, and you can even develop PTSD from witnessing a traumatic event. So one of my associate doctors was actually at the Boston Marathon when the Boston bombing occurred. And, you know, she said they heard the explosions, they went for cover, and it was many, many hours actually before they really knew what had happened. And, you know, certainly it was a little distressing to be there, but the data is clear. When people watched 6 or more hours of the Boston Marathon bombing on TV, they had more post-traumatic stress. It was probably about 20 years ago, one of my mentors told me, Bob, there's no such thing as really TV news. It's only TV bad news. If it bleeds, it leads. And here's what he told me. He says, I strongly recommend you take a news fast. Well, I've done that for 20 years, and I can tell you there's nothing that's happened in the entire world that the news needed to tell me, including a hurricane. You know, if I see lines outside the gas station and I go to the store and people are, you know, buying water by the cases, I will ask, hey, what's going on? They'll say, well, you haven't heard there's a hurricane coming, you know, and then I'll Google the weather map. It's easy enough to do. But the TV news is bad. I had a cartoon that I posted on my Facebook wall, and a reporter was asking the Amish, you know, why aren't you affected by this virus? And the person said, because we don't have TV. You know, and I want you to think about that for a moment. TV seems to want to magnify the bad stuff, forget about the good stuff, and make it look like it's really prevalent. So you might consider getting away from the TV. When we start looking at cortisol and depression, over 8,500 studies. So very, very strong medical link. Some of it's blood flow, others is that the happy chemicals are actually shifted towards fight or flight chemistry, even within the brain. So if you've seen these episodes before, you know that I have, you know, tricks and tools that I love. My favorite overall nutrient that basically I recommend across the board is called Ganoderma lucidum, also known as reishi. It buffers stress in the body, mind, and spirit. I'll show you that reference later, but it is really good for the brain. It increases brain circulation. It calms brain inflammation. It's good for the happy chemical serotonin, the calming chemical GABA, the memory chemical acetylcholine, and the focus chemical dopamine. And you know, anybody that likes to look at the data, they can screenshot this and look at all of those wonderful references. So, you know, as we work our way to the other part of the body, we realize that this quote is very, very powerful. You're either making stress hormones or you're making sex hormones, not both. So I know we have some people that like the science here. So your brain releases something called corticotropin releasing factor. And when it does that, it basically blocks the release of something called gonadotropin releasing factor. So in women, that'll stop ovulation and balance of sex steroids. In men, it literally shuts off testosterone and sperm. And you might ask the question, why would you shut off testosterone, you know, in times of fight or flight? Well, the adrenaline is going to push your muscles as hard as it can, your circulation as hard as it can. And remember that testosterone is a sex steroid and an anabolic steroid, and you're not going to be building anything. One of Sapolsky's quotes is, you know, if you know a tornado's coming, you're not going to paint your house today. If the tornado passes and you still have a house tomorrow, paint it then. So it shuts off growth and repair, reproduction, and anything that has to do with overall health. Another reference on brain health, I realize I had that one out of sequence, but Ganoderma is really, really good for the brain. When we start looking at stress making you fat, I have a pretty technical chart that I have at the end that sometimes brainiacs like it, but the simple fact is that when you're under chronic stress, it shuts down your metabolism. Corticotropin releasing factor shuts down thyrotropin releasing factor, and cortisol inhibits the activation of thyroid hormone. It opposes the action of insulin, and insulin says store fat, don't break down fat. And by the way, it also gives you a weird type of hunger. And since you're in fight or flight, what are you hungry for? You're hungry for quick energy, carbs, sugar, things that raise insulin, things that are not good for you long term. So here's a little bit of the nerdy explanation of what stress does to body composition, but stress is going to increase epinephrine and norepinephrine, and these are the acute stress hormones, also known as adrenaline and noradrenaline. These ultimately require methyl groups to neutralize them, and we methylate 1 billion times a second, so it's not just important for brain chemistry, but we know that methylation is a major factor in clinical depression. We know that when people are depressed, their number one strategy in the US to become undepressed is actually to feed with sugar. Sugar is very, very powerful at stimulating the reward centers. After you eat too many carbohydrates, you ultimately change the receptors where it takes more carbohydrate to get the same benefit, which is going to decrease your pleasure perception. And then ultimately, that's going to create a vicious cycle where you're going to be eating more and more and more. Cortisol opposes the action of insulin, and insulin is something that will actually decrease something called sex hormone binding globulin. That's actually reproductive. When the ancestors had food, that was the time to procreate. But this actually leads to increased free estrogen in the body. And literally every man, woman, and child now is proven to have toxic estrogens in their system. And now they're having more effects. And estrogens increase something called thyroid hormone binding globulin, which decreases the availability of thyroid hormone, thyroid action, which acts directly on mitochondria, which is where fat burning occurs. So you have decreased fat burning and increased obesity. Cortisol acts on an enzyme called 5'-deiodinase. This is the enzyme that converts T4, the most abundant thyroid hormone, to T3, the most active. It also, by the way, breaks down reverse T3, which is the major inhibitor of thyroid function. And there's another mechanism by which we have decreased thyroid action, decreased fat burning, and increased obesity. Cortisol causes weight gain in the middle. That is belly fat. And we know that this fat is much more inflammatory. So it's going to increase something called interleukin 6, which, by the way, will deplete nitric oxide. And you can't get oxygen to the mitochondria, but also that would alter your sexual function and put you at cardiovascular risk. But the central obesity has a higher concentration of an enzyme of aromatase that converts testosterone to estrogen. And therefore, we again increase thyroid hormone binding globulin, decrease thyroid action, decrease fat burning, and increase obesity. The first adrenal steroid that drops is actually DHEA. DHEA is an anti-aging hormone. It's an immune supportive hormone. It's actually an autoimmune modulator, and it also supports fat burning. So when DH is low, there's lower activity, what's called the peroxisome proliferated activated receptor, which is where the body activates its major fat burning. And again, you can potentially have obesity. Finally, cortisol is what's called a glucocorticoid. It breaks down lean tissue, muscle, to free up amino acids, specifically glucogenic amino acids, so that your body has more sugar with which to fight or flee. But as we said, we're not fighting or fleeing, so we have less muscle available to burn fat, and that's going to make us more obese. So when you start looking at that, you say, well, why would anybody run in chronic stress? Well, sadly, they probably don't have really good strategies to get out of it. So my favorite is Ganoderma. I also, by the way, like low-dose melatonin, like 1 to 2 milligrams every waking hour. That directly binds to the adrenal cortex and drops the central nervous system drive on stress. And I like theanine, which calms the brain. It's actually what's called a GABA facilitator. But I always like this reference. Ganoderma calms the body, the mind, and the spirit. And those are all PubMed citations. And someone might say, really, it calms the spirit? Hey, it's in the medical literature. It's known as the herb of spiritual potency. If your body's calm, your mind's calm, you're more likely to be in a more spiritual state than not. So with that said, that's a crash course on stress. And now that I've used that term, either you get away from the stress or you're going to crash and burn, and not in a fun way. So, my beautiful friend Carol, any questions in the chat?
Okay, well, we're going to give them a few minutes to put some questions in there. The first one I did have, though, is Organo by chance testing the Ganoderma against COVID relief, or are they allowed to do that?
Well, that's a really good question. If they are, I don't know about it, but given that this is such a tightly regulated environment, I would suggest that maybe not, right? But I don't know for sure. So for instance, I did a phone consult yesterday with an individual that had an acute onset of something called transverse myelitis. Now, for those of us that are non-technical in the room, myelin is what lines the brain and spinal cord, and it helps our nerves to fire efficiently and smoothly. And transverse myelitis means there's a level of the spinal cord that just got inflamed across and the myelin was destroyed. And it can be triggered by an autoimmune response, which can be triggered by a chronic virus. Well, they ultimately determined that this man who is currently a quadriplegic, we're hoping to get him function back, It was triggered by the West Nile virus. And so I created a nutrition protocol, and I said, you know what, I haven't found the PubMed citation on Ganoderma and the West Nile virus, but I'll look it up. And so this is so powerful, I'm actually gonna pull this slide out and put it within the presentation, at least for the purpose of sharing. So when we talk about immunity, we know that Ganoderma is proven to even block replication of the HIV virus. And can you see this share now? Carol, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. So when we look, here's the language here. It was shown that 11 preparations of Ganoderma, this other 2 herbs, completely inhibited the infective activity of the West Nile virus. And they used a lot of other things, including like herpes 2 simplex. So the medical literature shows that Ganoderma is really good against some of the worst viruses in the history of the planet. We also know that Ganoderma increases natural killer cells. Natural killer cells kill viral infected cells, cancer cells. And so there's so much data. So ultimately, when it is studied, you know, and I don't know when that'll happen, but I can tell you, one of the first lectures I gave on this virus, I looked back at the research on SARS-CoV-1, and Ganoderma was proven as an effective agent against SARS-CoV. So, but we can't say anything about this current virus.
Of course, we're not allowed to say those things.
Would be very upset, yes.
Yes. What are your thoughts on Ganoderma as an antidepressant?
Well, it's proven. It's actually proven in the medical literature to have powerful antidepressive properties. So if we were to show the stats, there's one from a very old Journal of Clinical Psychiatry that used these exact words. There's universal agreement that 75% of all depression is stress-induced. So when you're under chronic stress, your brain is not firing happy chemicals, it's firing, you know, non-happy chemicals, including anxious and fight or flight chemicals. So Ganoderma buffers that overall body stress drive. It improves the brain circulation. It improves serotonin and dopamine. We talked about dopamine when I gave it the run over. I talked about focus, which is in the frontal cortex, but there's a section of the brain called the locus ceruleus where dopamine is more than joy. It's even you know, they'll use this term like ecstasy, you know, just profound happiness. So it's proven to enhance those processes. Now, with that said, right, we can't make any health claim. I can tell you that the medical literature says that Ganoderma is proven to benefit that, but then we'd have to say, you know, you'd have to go to your own professional to find out what they recommend. And here's what I would suggest, you know, find someone who's skilled in helping to create a healthy brain. Because remember what Daniel Amen discovered after 83,000 brain scans, that mental health, mental joy is going to be the same as brain health, brain joy. They're tightly interrelated.
Okay. Marva had a friend who had 4 accidents, which sounds absolutely dreadful. She has severe back and shoulder pain, low mobility, and her right arm. Do you think Ganoderma can help with that? Perhaps which one?
Well, it's shown to modulate the inflammatory process by at least a dozen different mechanisms. It's also supposed to proven to enhance tissue recovery after trauma. So those are a couple things that we're looking at. So when you ask, could it be helpful? Sure. Will it be the total solution for accidents? I don't know how bad they were. Most people that I see that have multiple accidents, they're pretty beat up, you know, and they need some structural care, they need some TLC, and they need some good nutrition. And usually some corrective exercises.
Okay.
And my favorite for that, by the way, spores. Spores are my favorite.
Okay, perfect. What would you suggest, spores or mycelium for stress, or would that be based on the person?
You know, it doesn't have to be an either or, it can be an and. And so we have people, you know, we have some people that say, you know what, I take the mycelium and my brain just feels so good. Yeah, I see you nodding your head because I have you on my picture. I don't know what everybody else is seeing, but you know, we have plenty of people that do that, and that may well be your experience. And then we have other people that say, you know, I don't feel much with the mycelium, but the Ganoderma lucidum is great for me. You know, and then should the spores be like the Ganoderma lucidum, only stronger? Well, in theory, they should be, but they're also there's a higher price point on that. So that's the premium product. So some people, their cost concerns are just, okay, let's just go with the option that we can afford.
Perfect. Thoughts on migraines? I know this one comes up a lot. What's your go-to?
I'm going to pull up the PubMed because it's so powerful. And so let's see if I have the one I want. If not, I'll have to. So I have this article, and I think I'm going to share it. I'll have to do a new share. Share screen. And here it is. And so this is the International Journal of Pharmacy. And then they're talking about mushrooms. And then it talks about Ganoderma lucidum. I may blow that up maybe a little bit for you, if you can see it. So Ganoderma lucidum, and notice it says it has proved to completely eradicate migraine without side effects. So that's pretty powerful language from the International Journal Pharmacy. Now, did it say it was a universal cure for all migraine? No, no such thing exists. But there are many people that have had huge benefit from Ganoderma as it relates to migraines or non-migraine headaches or whatever aches and pains may be happening within the body.
Okay. This particular migraine that this person's asking about was caused by brain injury. Any suggestions to go with that?
Well, so we know that Ganoderma induces neural stem cells. We know that it increases brain circulation. We know that it enhances recovery after injury. And I did a brain session earlier in the year, and I had an individual, a patient last year, and I've got a full medical release and a video of him, but his name's Michael Morris. And he had such a traumatic brain injury that basically, the family was called into the emergency room, and his kids bedside were told, hey, say goodbye to your father. He's not going to live through the evening. And so imagine a doctor having that level of certainty that someone was not going to survive to literally tell their kids, your dad's going to die, say goodbye. And so that's Michael Morris right there. And this is one side of his head, and this is the other side of his head. And the reason though he has those scars is because they cut pieces of his head off, and they had to relieve the brain swelling because the brain would have swelled so bad that it would have crushed his skull, his brain within it, and he would have died. And so ultimately, his inflammatory control, happened so fast, and his brain recovered so fast. In that video that I have of him on my Facebook page, he says at 21 days, I felt I could have jogged home from the hospital. Then they told him he'd only get about 60% of his cognitive processing back. And he finished, this was May of 2019 that he had his accident. By November of 2019, he received an award from his bank as being the #3 banker in the entire company. And he's a very smart man with cognition back. And he definitely, number one, he gives credit to God, and make no mistake about it. If God says, yes, we're okay. If he says, no, we're gone. But he did his part, he said, with really good nutrition. And so, that's just a good testimony for all of us. So what do I think about it in terms of brain injury? An absolute must. And in a perfect world, we have it on board all the time. So I showed you that reference on West Nile. What if this gentleman were getting multiple daily doses of Ganoderma, and West Nile actually caused him to become a quadriplegic by inducing something called transverse myelitis? Well, guess what? If Ganoderma completely eradicated the infectivity of West Nile, wouldn't it be good to have that in our system? If it can block replication of HIV, wouldn't it be good to have it in our system? If it's proven to prevent the damaging effects of heart attack or stroke, wouldn't it be good to have it in our system? If it makes us more calm and we're more alert and we have better decision-making capacity, maybe we don't make the wrong move that gets us in the accident in the first place. So how far does this go? One of my mentors said this, and I never met him because he died before, long before I ever came across his work, but it was B.J. Palmer. He said, you may never know what you may think, say, or do, and how it can affect the lives of millions tomorrow. So what if we save a life by giving them a better option? What if a new baby's born because of a healthier option? Sick animals can't reproduce, but we have people, and lots of them at this point, that have now multiple babies when they're told they could never have children. And suddenly their body got healthy, and look what happened. Some really good stuff.
That's amazing. We have a question on any recommendations for fatty liver.
So fatty liver is, in the medical literature, the first and major metabolic abnormality of insulin resistance. So insulin resistance is pre-diabetes. Now keep in mind that cortisol opposes the action of insulin. So by the way, does epinephrine and norepinephrine. So all stress is going to raise blood sugar. That can raise insulin. Insulin is a storage hormone. It says store fat, don't break down fat. And any excess carbohydrate is converted to triglyceride in the liver. So if you have a lot of extra sugar around and you're converting it, fatty liver is the first major metabolic abnormality of insulin resistance. And so can fatty liver go away? Well, we see it all the time. How do we do it? We eat better, we exercise, we start losing fat, and yeah, guess what? The liver will lose the fat too.
Perfect. Another question, what about, I'm going to try this, aphasia?
You said it well. So,
yay!
So I could do a quick PubMed search and see if Ganoderma is, directly related to that, but that's a brain health issue. So if we can improve brain circulation, brain neurotransmitters, brain stem cells, in the long run, could it make a difference? And the answer is, the conclusion has to be yes, whether they study or not. So, I look, and one of my favorite stories is I had a patient come to me, 9 years ago with a really aggressive brain cancer, and she was given a year to live. And I loaded her up on Ganoderma and other things, right? We're not a one-trick pony. We gave her a ketogenic diet, other immune support herbs, et cetera, et cetera. And within a year, instead of being dead, she was cancer-free, and now she's cancer-free for 8 years. So when you start looking at that, and by the way, it wasn't until 2019 that there was a peer-reviewed medical study that showed that Ganoderma was effective against the most aggressive brain tumor called glioblastoma. So, when you start looking at that, you say, well, can it help with X, Y, or Z? My classic answer is, I don't know if it'll help, but it sure won't hurt. And that you can take to the bank.
We do have Sharon Richard is letting us know in the chat that she has not been using any medication or even Tylenol in the last 3 months for migraines. So maybe she can tell us what she's been taking.
Yeah, I will tell you, and someone wanted to give a testimonial a few weeks ago. We had our regulators, really not our regulators, right? The regulators are on every company. And so as the leaders, we were told, you want to be very cautious about naming any condition
that helped.
And by the way, isn't that a testimony to something that needs to change? Because the only thing you can make a health claim on is a drug. And here's what one of my mentors told me. He says, imagine that you took a person perfectly healthy. And I won't say I'm perfectly healthy, but I'm healthy, right? And what if you started giving me drugs? Well, I become less healthy, right? And then he asked, well, why do we give drugs to sick people and think we're going to make them healthier? Now, I'm the first to tell you that drugs have a place, and I'm very grateful for modern pharmaceuticals. Michael Morris, when he had that traumatic brain injury, thank God for medicine removing parts of his skull. Thank God for strong anti-inflammatories. Thank God for skilled doctors. But then also thank God that he had the foresight to put stuff in his body that really had him ready for that big hit, to the point where he could recover and feel like he could jog home 3 weeks later. That's pretty impressive.
Okay, perfect. Does anybody else have any other questions this evening? They seem very quiet. This is usually when all the questions come piling through.
Well, then I'll make a comment or two. So, we have a team all over the world. So I do calls at different times. So I did a European Zoom at 2 o'clock this afternoon for the UK time. So that would have been 8 p.m. for them. And there was a huge interest in immunity and autoimmunity. And so from the journal Autoimmunity, it says this: Ganoderma can be used to treat and or prevent autoimmune disease. And so when you look at the list of autoimmune diseases, it's growing, growing, growing. And there's now over 100 named diseases on that list. And by the way, when I mentioned that case of that individual with transverse myelitis, that's suggested to be autoimmune, in this case, a viral trigger.
Okay. We do actually have another question thrown in the chat. Ganoderma for back pain.
So I haven't seen a study directly on back pain, but so there are studies on pain relief from really horrific, painful conditions like rheumatoid arthritis. So there was a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial where they took 3 groups of people. One group got Ganoderma, one group got the top drug, one group got a sugar pill. They all had rheumatoid arthritis. The group that got Ganoderma got dramatically better. It beat even the prescription pain pill without the downside. We also then shared a study on fibromyalgia, a horrifically debilitating condition of pain all over the body and inflammatory process and other issues. And in a 6-week trial, Ganoderma was good for that. So even though we don't really see anything for like a regional pain, like low back or neck pain or shoulder pain, pain chemistry is going to be the same in the body. And therefore, if we can modulate it in those horrible conditions, we can likely modulate it in the lesser conditions.
Okay. Can Ganoderma help with spinal stenosis?
Well, so that would be a pretty tough thing. So what happens with spinal stenosis is we have a spinal canal, and I'm just going to make it this circle here, and my spinal cord goes through that, and our nerves go through that too. And you're born with a certain size spinal canal, and I'll just use this hole here. So there's a congenital stenosis where people are born with a smaller canal. So if I have a spinal canal this big, and I want to put a spinal tube through it, and I'll just use my finger as an option, right? You can see I have a lot of room when it's that big, but when it's that big, then I have problems. So if they have any degenerative condition at all, it can actually start to compress the spinal cord. So could Ganoderma keep better muscle balance? Yes. Could it improve circulation? Yes. Could it reduce the inflammatory process? Yes. Could it give people the energy to move around better? Yes. Does it induce better sleep? Yes. Could those things be preventive against the degenerative central canal stenosis? And the answer is preventive, yes. Reversal, highly unlikely. But I've seen plenty of people with spinal stenosis, because that's my specialty, right? I'm a chiropractor, kinesiologist, nutritionist, acupuncturist, etc. And I can tell you that there's people that are told they need surgery, but when we create better balance and core strength, many times that's not the case. And so you tend to recommend the tools that you have. Surgeons get paid to do surgery. They recommend surgery. And by the way, I believe they're mostly good people and they've dedicated their lives, but that's what they know. So that's what they recommend. But we've seen plenty of people that didn't need it when they were told they needed it. And part of a comprehensive program would be Ganoderma, but it's not going to undo that, but maybe it prevents progression.
Okay. Someone asked if Ganoderma can help with plaque in the arteries.
So the answer would have to be yes, but I'm going to have to go through some sequencing to get there. And so when we start looking at plaquing within the arteries, people think, well, if you have high cholesterol, you have plaquing, and that's absolutely not accurate at all. There's a damage to the lining of the arteries, which is called the endothelium, and then cholesterol and calcium form a Band-Aid over it. It's basically a calcified plaque Band-Aid over an injury. And plaque generally isn't the problem, but it's actually unstable plaque. So if you could have, let's say, 50% blockage of an artery, and you won't even have symptoms. But and there's plenty of videos that show that. There's so much reserve in these arteries that you wouldn't have symptoms. Now, I don't know if you ever heard, whoever asked this question, of someone saying, oh my God, I went to the doctor, they said I had 100% blockage. Thank God I was there, I would have had a heart attack. Or 99% or 98%, But here's the deal. Our body is always increasing our circulation based on our activity. So when people are physically active, if they start developing a blockage, the body reroutes the blood vessels around it. That is a constant phenomena, and it's natural collateral circulation. And so now, does Ganoderma enhance that? Absolutely. Does Ganoderma stabilize plaque? It does by increasing nitric oxide, because nitric oxide is the primary mechanism that stabilizes plaque. Could Ganoderma prevent the plaquing? Yeah, because it could prevent the endothelial damage, which is due to oxidation, and then ultimately increased by inflammatory process. So all those things go together. But there's a study out of Stanford with about 500 of the worst cardiovascular patients, and they actually found that the most important parameter in blood fat chemistry is actually HDL, high density lipoproteins. And when you look at a lipid panel, there's total cholesterol, there's HDL, LDL, and triglycerides. H stands for high density lipoproteins, L low density, and the rule is you want your highs high and your lows low. But ultimately, the Stanford study showed that when HDL exceeded triglycerides, then people could reverse plaquing, literally reverse plaquing within the arteries. So by being really good at enhancing insulin signaling and reducing the inflammatory process, Ganoderma can improve HDL, decrease triglycerides, and by that mechanism, overall lower the plaquing.
Okay, and let's end with this one. Ganoderma for oral health or pain in the teeth and gums.
So, you know, it's fascinating that the company Organo had a toothpaste, which was a really good toothpaste and a really good selling product. And by the way, we've had team members that have gone all over the world to get this toothpaste because the company actually discontinued the production of it. And the reason they discontinued it is because the retail price of the toothpaste was something like $22 American per tube. And it wasn't a real big seller. It was like less than 1% of the products they sold. But ultimately, those of us that love it, Kelly and I have told corporate, we will personally order 10,000 tubes if that's what you need to run it, because our team would do it. You know, we brought tubes back when I traveled elsewhere in the world, and I see Claudio, I might pin him on the screen there, because he still has it, right? So Claudio, the man with the prop, the man with the plan, just made that happen. And, we love that toothpaste. And so we got it, so we're still trying to get that back. So.
Okay, we actually had one more question squeak in, so let's make sure we don't leave Trish out here. Advice for muscular dystrophy in a 51-year-old female.
Well, first and foremost, at 51, that's pretty epic because that's well beyond the standard life expectancy of someone with muscular dystrophy. So now that's a genetic issue. And so can we change the genes? No, but can we modify the expression of the genes in a way that prevents further breakdown? And I have a case study right within my office now. I had a young man come to me, my first year in clinical practice. And, I think he was 23 years old at that time. And he had so much withering of his lower extremities that they said, you know what, you're not even going to make it to 35. You've got a very aggressive form of muscular dystrophy. Well, I think he's 52 or 53 today. So now he wasn't supposed to make it to 35. So first and foremost, that's never a man's call, right? I always tell people, hey, I'm not in the business of miracles, but I'm certainly in the business of helping people to believe in miracles and helping them cultivate their own miracles. And so my patient, Ronnie, still has a miracle, right? He's getting it every day. And it sounds like if this person is 51, she's getting it every day too. But you want to do everything you can to minimize your stress, optimize your nutrition, optimize your recovery. And one of the things we know with muscular dystrophy, the muscles don't recover well. So, vigorous activity for you, maybe, 30 seconds of walking every hour. That might just be where you're at. And that will be a level of exercise that will help your body move forward. And then maybe you get a little more tolerance and you can go, 35 seconds an hour at some point in time. But, these are things that we're all dealt a little different hand, and we need to play the hand that we're dealt. And so I was doing some studying on Stephen Hawking's, and he had Lou Gehrig's disease, and he was, diagnosed in his early 20s. and he lived into his 70s. He wasn't even supposed to live 5 years. But here's what Stephen Hawking said. He said, you know what? Because I was disconnected from my body, it allowed me to expand my mind. And he's one of the most powerful theoretical physicists in the history of the planet. And so, you know, whatever hand you're dealt, there's a plan for you, and it's a really good plan. So if we can find a way to honor that, I think that's the best that we can do, you know, for ourselves, our family, and our world.
Well, thank you once again, Dr. Bob. Let's have everybody turn on their cameras. And if you'd like to wrap it up for us.
Yeah, well, I'm going to give the old screenshot there where we can look at everybody at once, because I love all the beautiful smiling faces.
In a
And I see
second.
plenty, plenty, plenty of them. Yay, 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 yay. So, all right, I'll wrap up as I do. We're going to do this again next week, but I'm Dr. Bob Rakowski.
Yeah, let's wait. Let's wait.
Absolutely knowing we can all be happy, healthy, and successful.
Unmute.
Thanks, Dr.
Thank you,
Bob.
Dr. Bob.
Bye.
Thanks, Dr. Bob.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Dr. Bob.
Love
Thank
you,
you.
Dr. Bob.
Good night.
I'm not done yet. 2 seconds.
All right.